this is an extraordinary place to meet in Foix. Cambridge is a very flat town, and to be surrounded by mountains creates a wonderfully welcoming space. And I want to talk about really the radical theories beneath the notion of hospitality. I think we use the word hospitality quite loosely and quite freely, but it's a very important word that means the welcome of the stranger. And I want to focus on that welcome of the stranger in relation to the hospitality industry, to get you to think about how the hospitality industry is engaged in international relations. And also whether tourism in the context of international relations has a role to play, a positive role. Can tourism be a path for peace? I also want to suggest that to think about tourism in the context of this deep, important, fundamental notion of hospitality also requires us to think about storytelling. A lot of you I know are engaged in the study and the practice of marketing, and we use le storytelling quite often. But storytelling is fundamental as hospitality, and the two things are very connected in how the human species has shaped relationships and space, really since the birth of humanity. So I want to look at hospitality in connection not only then with international relations, but the importance of storytelling, and to see whether in that context, the stories that we produce in the context of tourism are conducive to justice and peace, or whether actually they entrench injustice. So I'm going to suggest that you all have a huge responsibility on the global as well as the local stage in a peace building or a peace destroying activity. Now, about me, those of you with whom I've been talking, and thank you for these early conversations, will know that I'm coming from a foreign place. And that doesn't just mean that I'm coming from the other side of the channel. Post-Brexit, you might think that we're all shut in there. Sometimes it can feel like that. But I'm coming from a very different stable in terms of education and teaching and research. I'm an 18th century intellectual historian. And at this point, I imagine many of you wish to run to the back door. My research, as you can see on the left-hand side, as just two of my publications, has been focused on the debates, the theorizing, the panicking expressed across a range of genres, but not least in a huge world history written by or edited by somebody called the Abbé Raynal, who was born not so many miles away from here. In the 18th century, people were concerned about what we might call early globalization. What is going to happen to our relationship with here if we are exploring and making connections across the planet? So that's one of the pillars of my research in the 18th century, the expansion of Europe overseas, a history that is about commerce, and it's also about colonialism. You can see the second book that I've given you, à titre illustratif, is that my research is also, in the 18th century, about the rise, the so-called rise, the development of the genre of the modern novel. Now, very often we think of the political theories and the novel in different spaces. One is fluffy storytelling, that is popularizing and giving diversions, the sorts of things you do when you don't really want to think seriously. Well, I want to question that, and indeed what I've been trying to do in my research over several decades is to show that the novel emerges in the 18th century precisely because of early globalization. That narrative gives us a technology, as I was saying before, of adapting to rapid change on a scale that is impossible to control, hard to conceive of. But I have a third hat that I also want to throw into the ring today. I run a center for global human movement. And that you can see on the right-hand side of the screen operates on a very interdisciplinary level. And indeed, not just between academic disciplines, but we are aiming to work across sectors as well. Why? Well, to address today's complex global challenges, we need to bring all sorts of perspectives and methodologies around the table. And I want to make a strong case for why we need the arts and humanities around the policy-making table, as well as the sciences and technologies. It seems to me that you in tourism are actually engaging with all of these disciplines and are in a very interesting space to consider how policy in the complex global world of today requires drawing expertise from all disciplines, including the past and including the literary subjects. So, about the lecture, I think it's going to be a marathon for me, but probably even more for you. I've been asked to speak in English, so that will allow me to gabble away, do, as I say, indicate when I'm going too fast. But I would like to propose that this allows for an exercise. This is, if you like, a practical experience for us all. This is an experience in listening to a foreign language for many of you. That already brings the intercultural into play. But above all, it's an experience, an exercise in actually how do we listen to people who are different. So if we go back to that notion of hospitality, which is the welcome of the stranger, that begins here. How much space is it possible to make in your conceptualization of your subject for what is on the outside? So just to give you some signposts, I shall begin with a historical perspective from the 18th century. I'll then move into something that's closer to your own literature, and that is the peace tourism debates, considering whether there is aspiration within the tourist industry now for peace tourism. And then the third section will be anecdotal and speculative, and it will be my own experiences recently as a tourist visiting a National Trust property in the southwest of England. Now, students often in a lecture want a take-home. I don't know what the expression in French would be for a take-home, but what's the bottom line? What am I going to get out of this? Again, I would remind you of the context of hospitality that I'm trying to put central in the context of intercultural dialogue and tourism. Our desire to get to what's useful to me happens in every context. So what's going to be useful? Can I get something from this and leave all the rest behind? So I warn you that that's going to perhaps be a difficult challenge here. But in order to, if you like, give you at least a proposition for you to think about that might be articulated as a precise question, I want to suggest, but it will be for debate, that if we locate local tourist sites in a much broader and deeper history of global movement, of global exchanges, that won't dilute the sense of patrimoine. That won't dilute the sense of place and authentic culture at the local level. I want to suggest that, to the contrary, if we can insert tourist sites, specifically those that seem the most local, the most, if you like, off the beaten track, that can help to put those places quite literally on a bigger map. And I want to suggest, although you may wish to push back, that may add to the significance and attraction for those who live locally as well as those who visit from afar. To condense that in a question, I want to suggest that we do well to think about how we promote inclusive tourism and whether inclusive tourism means rethinking the boundary between local and global, rethinking who is local, who is an outsider. And a deep question within that is, why does that matter? You might think it doesn't, but I think it's worth debating. So to begin with the historical section, this is where I'm most at ease, and I imagine most of you feel the least familiar. I'm starting with a quotation, you can see in French on the right-hand side, from what is often seen as a monument to the Western European Enlightenment, a monument to the leading role of France in that development. And I've taken you straight, and that monument is the Encyclopédie ou Dictionnaire raisonné des sciences et des arts, written par une société de gens de lettres. So already a collaborative volume, edited by Diderot, a philosophe born in Langres, and d'Alembert, a famous mathematician. Ask your colleagues who are doing maths, and they will have heard of d'Alembert's theorem. What is of interest to me here is how the theme of hospitality is emerging in this context of early globalization as a topic of considerable anxiety. If you look at the second paragraph, you can see that l'esprit de commerce, en unissant toutes les nations, a rompu les chaînons de bienfaisance des particuliers. So that's the tension, is that hospitality, which had been the most traditional form of international relations, functioning on an interpersonal level through human acts of kindness and generosity and welcome, seems to be disappearing, being destroyed by commerce. Commerce, which is based on transactional relationships. When you've paid your debt, you have no binding relationship. Now you can see that the writers here are balanced. It's not saying commerce is bad, but commerce has changed social relations. And one of the worries is that les liens, or l'amour qui liait autrefois les hommes par les nœuds tendres et touchants, are giving way to relationships based on interest. Les gens riches y ont gagné dans leur voyage la jouissance de tous les agréments du pays, où ils se rendent joints à l'accueil poli qu'on leur accorde à proportion de leurs dépenses. Mais on les voit avec plaisir et sans attachement. So the concern is that a commercial structure for relationships does not build up the sorts of relationships on which peace between nations, peace that crosses borders, is based. Now you can see in the first paragraph that the anxiety is emerging from le fait que toute l'Europe est devenue voyageante et commerçante. This is a period where the infrastructure for travel is rapidly changing and improving. Roads are getting better because people are traveling. You get the emergence of restaurants and hotels. You get lettres de change. You don't have to carry your sacks of gold and worry about being robbed along the way. All of which have made things much, much easier. But in that sort of framework, things on the social level are changing. The concern for hospitality arising from commerce arises from this movement. On the left, you've got an 18th century selfie. I think we might think about why the grand tourists of the period wanted to come back with paintings that had themselves in it. But why today do we want selfies? That's something I'm sure that you've reflected on, but just a quick suggestion. We want to insert ourselves in the story of our travels. We want to assert ourselves in another place. But the grand tourists were a minority. They were rich, male, leisured aristocrats. But it wasn't just those who were on the move. As we've just seen in the article Hospitalité, global commerce was making lots of other things on the move. There are plenty of other people on the move by choice or by coercion. This is the period of the triangular slave trade. It's a period of enslaved labor and indentured labor in particularly the sugar plantations in the Caribbean, from which raw products were coming and boosting the manufacturing industries, all of which were creating global circuits of objects on the move. And I hope you recognize on the right-hand side the local Canal du Midi, le Canal Royal de Languedoc, which was and remains one of the most impressive and important constructions and is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. I want to come back to the notion of what is World Heritage, so keep that in mind. But as I've been suggesting, with objects on the move, with manufactured goods on the move, with raw products on the move, people are being connected in a different mediated way with other places, and that has an impact. And just two things. If you take the example of coffee, on the left-hand side, I don't know, who has been to Paris? I guess there should be a lot of hands in the air. Perhaps not very many hands in the air, or people are feeling too hot to put hands in the air. Who's not been to Paris, then? Let's try it that way around. Lots of people are existentially uncertain as to where they've been. But Le Procope is now marketed as one of the historic coffee houses, cafes in Paris. Ostensibly, in the distance of the front door is Voltaire's desk. Now, the coffee that came to establishments in the 18th century, which were not just in Paris, were, as Voltaire also wrote about in his famous little short story, Candide, the product, as I've just mentioned, of enslaved labor. In seeing a mutilated man as Candide tours the New World, he asks how this fellow human species, fellow human has ended up in such a terrible state. C'est à ce prix que vous mangez du sucre en Europe. So already you can see the awareness of somebody like Voltaire that people need to recognize their connectivity with people elsewhere and other places. They might ignore that, but the reality is that places and therefore groups of people are connected. So Paris at the bottom is connected with, you can see, those draconian geometric lines of the sugar plantation, bringing in almost a factory-type existence. But it's not just the coffee that connects people in this period, but also things like porcelain. So on the left, you have Voltaire's coffee cup and saucer. That's at the Musée Carnavalet. China, porcelain, was a luxury product, but entering into France and the rest of Europe in ever greater quantities. And so you've also got the connection between places through porcelain with China. So sugar, coffee connects with the Caribbean. China, by the name, connects with that part of the world. And you also get rip-offs emerging. So it's not just the products that come directly, but the fashions that they stimulate. Now, there's a wonderful master's thesis by somebody local who's been looking at the presence of porcelain in this region, in Toulouse. And I think there's a lot of work to be done there. Christina and I went to look at the Château de Merville, and you've got the chinoiserie. Now, it's not painted by a Chinese artist, but you can see the imaginary is already entering into, if you like, the wallpaper of the region. So the point that I've really wanted to make to date is that you can't go back to the past and find that it was static. You can't go back and find what was local, pur et dur. Already, the local was imprinted with traces and the presence of the external, wider world. So what did that mean for the 18th century, and what does that mean for us now? So just to conclude this historical preamble, I've given you the opening page of a very famous text by Voltaire, the Traité sur la tolérance. And you can see it's a text that puts Toulouse directly center stage, but not for hospitality, but for hostility. So the question as to whether intercultural interaction brings peace was something of great doubt in the 18th century. The closer cultures seemed to be getting together, the more people seemed to be despising each other, the more that generated conflict. And that conflict began at very, very local level. It wasn't that we were all united, but within the we, further subdivisions were emerging. Now, this was an incident that was in 1761, as the Catholics were, from their point of view, celebrating the 200th anniversary of St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. That was a massacre where 2,000 Protestants were brutally murdered. And at that time, at the time of these celebrations, the son of a shopkeeper, Jean Calas, was found hung in the family house. Because of the angry mob, there was pressure to blame the father. Without any evidence, Jean Calas was tortured and then executed. And it was that that prompted Voltaire to write on the need for tolerance in the modern world. A couple of years later, Jean Calas was posthumously pardoned and the family compensated. And then a long time later, you can see the 250th anniversary of the rehabilitation. The house of Jean Calas, the Maison Calas, became a monument historique with a plaque, or at least it acquired a plaque in Toulouse. So in Toulouse, you have a souvenir, a memorial, a memory of what I would call dark tourism at the very center. You've got a memory of intolerance, of fanaticism that can't be externalized, but that it may be in response to a reaction of an ever more complex world. So there's a big question as to, as tourists, how one frames a site like that, what one does with it. Is it local? Is it international history? What is its purpose? So this takes me to my second topic. Oh, I have one more slide that will introduce that. The two faces of Voltaire. In 2015, at the time of the installation of that memorial plaque, Voltaire became seen as a national, indeed an international, well, a European hero for freedom of speech. The timing there was after the Charlie Hebdo attacks. Sales of Voltaire's Traité sur la tolérance soared. Whether people read the text is another matter, but as a sign of solidarity, there was a huge desire to side with tolerance. Je suis Charlie was, if you like, annexed by, or was associated with Voltaire. You can see there at the Boulevard Voltaire, that association. That was one side of Voltaire's image. 5 years later, in 2020, after the murder of George Floyd and in the wake of Black Lives Matter activism, you can see that Voltaire was reframed and red paint was poured over his statue in Paris. Voltaire's personal finances were entangled with the slave trade. So the point I want to make is that history is, of course, complex. And how we frame that history in relation to something like the Maison Jean Calin matters. Do we exclude the red-painted Voltaire from that wonderfully idealistic image of peace? Or do we include both? And if we include both, how do we straddle that gap? So we're now to the question that you might think is more appropriate for you to be thinking about after that historical prelude. Can tourism actually create peace? Given the long history of intercultural conflict, has tourism made any impact? Is tourism even relevant in these discussions? Now, one of the things I want to stress is that tourism isn't just neutrally reflecting on culture. Tourism and those who are engaged in it are co-creating culture. And culture is integral to almost every conflict in the world. I don't think the tourist industry has a choice as to whether it engages with this topic. I think the vital question is, does tourism make matters worse or better? How can tourism make matters better and not worse? Now, there's a very long-standing belief, an idealism, an international idealism, the idealism of internationalism, that tourism must inevitably cultivate intercultural understanding. Because tourism mixes up cultures, people meet other cultures, it must cultivate a better understanding of the other, and that must build up a more peaceful world. There have been endless pronouncements, whether by popes or by presidents, that tourism will foster a better world, that tourism is the instrument of peace building. You can see that the joint statement of Reagan and Gorbachev points in that direction. You can see that Bill Clinton gets on the bandwagon in a speech to the tourist industry in 1995. You can see there the Pope, and perhaps every year, it seems to be every year, that the Pope intervenes on World Tourism Day to insist on the peace-building functions of tourism. Although you can note in that third quotation a caveat, a caution. If tourism is to create peace, then it must be based on respectful and cordial relationships. But the fourth quotation indicates that it's not just presidents and popes, but peace-building organizations, most notably the United Nations, that has also backed the notion of tourism as the people's building block for global peace. That it will not only drive economic growth and alleviate poverty, but that will lead to peace. So a huge, if you like, hope that the sector that you're all engaged in is for the good. The more recent UN 2030 Sustainable Development Goals have maintained that optimism. Tourism is mentioned at least 16 times across the SDGs. And you can see in that headline on the left that tourism is critical in the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, that it underpins, directly or indirectly, all of them. Now, I want to draw attention in particular to Goal 16. It's not just that tourism loosely underpins, but most specifically, the UN, in its framework for a sustainable, just world, thinks that tourism can foster multicultural and interfaith tolerance and understanding, that tourism is the route to peace and justice. I'll just flag Goal 17 while we're at it. It doesn't think that that can be done in a narrow way, but it's reliant on a huge, complex infrastructure of many stakeholders. So collaboration is seen as the underpinning. Now, this notion that tourism delivers peace has underpinned the professionalization of the discipline since the beginning of the 20th century. The European Travel Commission in 1948 picks up on something that's already present in the early alliances and associations at national and international level, with a similar catchphrase that understanding through travel is the passport to peace. Let's note at this point that this idealism was present before the First World War. It was present after the First World War. It was present after the Second World War. Maybe people are beginning to see a little bit of a catch here, that the faith that tourism brings peace straddles all of that period. But the enthusiasm and, if you like, the legitimacy that this catchphrase of peace through tourism gave to the industry has been very strong throughout the 20th century. Here you can see a speech being given by the World Trade Organization, taking this discourse to New Delhi. And in many ways, it was ratified by the establishment of the International Institute for Peace Through Tourism. The guy you can see on the right has been an indefatigable campaigner for promoting tourism as the world's first global peace industry. So the story so far is, sure, there's been a long-standing belief tourism is the instrument for peace. So many people have backed that horse. We can leave it at that. Given so much hype around the subject in the 1980s, scholars in tourist studies began to question whether there was any evidence, and cynicism kicked in. So I've given you, some useful points of reference if you wish to follow this up. But there was now almost a sort of reversal, that tourism can't bring peace, that there's no evidence. And the sorts of arguments, you can see that there's a cynicism that the argument that tourism brings peace was really simply a way to clothe the tourist sector, to give it a legitimacy. And more people began to argue that it gave legitimacy to certain political projects that perhaps were less straightforwardly desirable, they might appear. So as I say, some of the evidence was already there in front of people's eyes. Tourism did not stop the First World War. Between the wars, travel across Europe continued between the previous and the future combatants. So it would seem, just looking at European tourism and European conflict, that peace was certainly not a consequence of tourism, but perhaps simply a requirement for tourism. The cynicism now became deeper and that is individuals can do nothing towards peace. Ultimately, on the basis of things like the First and Second World War, critics began to suggest that ultimately foreign policy at top level international relations was ultimately what dominated. And it was not low-level people power that really determined a culture of peace. The interaction between tourists was deemed to be superficial and limited, and therefore the notion of contact theory taken from the sociologists as the framework for intercultural understanding was inappropriate. That required intensive interaction over time, whereas mass tourism was seen to be like oil and water that glide through. And the cynicism not only questioned the correlation and the direction of that correlation, but began to wonder whether it was not that peace and tourism were connected, but actually that tourism risked reinforcing the sorts of stereotypes from which conflict emerges. And of course, there's plenty of evidence that tourism generates conflict. We were talking earlier on about conflict in the mountains, where those who live locally feel that tourism is destroying their heritage, destroying the environment, destroying their way of life. It's not just that there is conflict between locals and tourists, but also that tourism creates conflict within the industry. I am sure you know better than I that the income generated by tourism is not distributed evenly amongst all stakeholders. And therefore, there are resentments in the social hierarchies that underpin much of the sector. At least these are the arguments being made. And as I hinted earlier, there was increasing evidence that the notion of peace through tourism had been and continues to be co-opted by undemocratic and oppressive regimes. The literature tends to point to Burma, today Myanmar, where tourism was a way of bringing in hard currency, and that currency was being used to buy arms to continue a repressive regime. Which takes me to the notion of conflict tourism, which is now an emerging area. People wanting to travel to previous war zones, to active war zones. Conflict tourism, also known under the heading of dark tourism. I've given you a little definition on the left of dark tourism, but it might be also understood as conflict tourism. I've given you a little a bibliography there. But there are now research centers that are trying to think about how conflict through tourism can be resolved. So we've gone from enthusiasm, idealism, to cynicism, to now a new reconfiguration as to the relationship between tourism and conflict or peace. I'd like to give you two reasons why you shouldn't lose attention at this point. I think I hinted at the beginning, but I'm going to say again, is that peace is something we all desire. We only need to look at the news at the moment to realize how important peace is and how lucky we are to be enjoying peace in the space that we are currently inhabiting. So two reasons we can't give up the exercise of trying to direct tourism towards peace is that tourism plays a massively influential role in shaping the world in which we live. Despite the pandemic, numbers are resurgent in terms of international arrivals and global exports, bouncing back, although not necessarily equally. So one reason we can't ignore this question is that tourism now is a massive force, and it's a massive social, cultural, and political force. it is shaping the world, and therefore it requires reflection by all stakeholders as to how that works its way through. Now, what has been useful here within the research world of tourism studies, and it perhaps gives you ideas of where other people are going in their masters and PhDs in the field of tourism studies, is that people have been drawing insights from a much more long-standing intellectual tradition and research area, that of peace studies. Peace studies have grown up because of conflict and very much in collaboration with practitioners on the ground in places where reconciliation is absolutely necessary and required, whether it's Northern Ireland, whether it's in South Africa, whether it's in Rwanda. There are plenty of options to see where peacemaking, reconciliation has emerged as a necessary focus for research and activity. Now, from the world of peace studies, and Galtung is the person typically referenced in this context. If there's just one person that you look up, he would be the one, is that Galtung has made a very useful distinction that continues to underpin the discussions of peace. And that is, peace is not simply the absence of conflict. That is really simply negative peace. It's not yet conflict. Galtung distinguishes between this negative form of peace, the absence of violence, with what he calls positive peace. And positive peace, and this may be a little difficult to understand immediately, is defined as the absence of structural violence, not, if you like, fisticuffs of actual armed violence, but the absence of the violence that's happening at a cultural level from injustice. What that means is that social injustice may not erupt immediately in terms of violence, but it creates oppression, and oppression, you know, the laws of physics, if you repress a spring, it will spring back at some point. And therefore, structural violence is the context that comes from social injustice, that is creating a cultural context that fuels conflict. So positive peace will have to address structural conditions of injustice at a cultural level. And here, the good news, as we return to tourist studies, is that here it's not just about high-level international relations. It's above all, as we're talking about culture, about individual acts. Individual acts, however small, however apparently trivial, contribute either to consolidating and developing a culture of violence by maintaining structural inequalities, or by moving towards a culture of peace. Now, alongside peace studies and this resurgence of interest in tourism and understanding and mitigating conflict, has emerged this genre called dark tourism. I mean, here's a little quiz. Can anybody tell me where we are on the top left? Any guesses there? Shout it out. So Japan, so the Hiroshima Peace Park. The Hiroshima Peace Park, I've got some dates here. So that was opened in 1955. Quite clearly in the middle, you've got the Kigali Genocide Memorial, which was opened in 2004 in Rwanda. At the bottom in the middle, any guesses? So that's the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum in Poland, opened shortly after the Second World War in 1947. I would commend you very much to look up on the internet the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. That was opened just a few years ago, 2018, and it's dedicated to victims of racial terror lynchings, and so it's sometimes known as the National Lynching Memorial Museum. But it is a very interesting way of creating a site which has become, or is intended to be, like all of these other examples, a tourist site that is on a tourist trail, that is looking to address the sorts of injustice on a racialized level and not just inter-ethnic conflict as you have in the Genocide Memorial and in Auschwitz-Birkenau. And I don't think anybody needs me to tell you about the bottom image, opened in 2006. But again, many attempts not just to memorialize, but to add to the peace-building function by bringing these things on a tourist trail. So after that little interlude in dark tourism via peace studies, let's just return to some obvious lessons about tourism that might begin to make the link between dark tourism and more regular tourism. Whether there is regular tourism is perhaps a debating point, but the sorts of tourism that we don't associate with these emergent categories. And here's a very sensible and I think important statement from Salazar. It says, tourism doesn't begin when you are at the site that you are sightseeing. Tourism begins before you embark. Tourism begins with the constructions of a worldview, a map, a conceptual map of the world that allows you to navigate the world. It's a construction of a worldview that enables us to tour the world. But of course, how we imagine the world is not truth. It's not absolute. It's not without multiple historical and arbitrary and fantastical and false dimensions. So Salazar is pointing to how tourism, because it is based on worldviews, becomes a site where either normativity is reaffirmed, or it can become a space where different worldviews can be brought into relief and questioned and perhaps renegotiated. So this is what takes me to the notion of storytelling. What is it that underpins a worldview? What is it indeed that underpins the conditions that maintain intractable conflict? And in both cases, it's what people refer to, whether it's Lyotard or Bourdieu or many others, as master narratives. That is, the sorts of narratives that emerge as truth in particular groups. They're not imposed as propaganda from one source, but they emerge through repetition that becomes acceptable and conventional, and that holds people to account for what other people think, what seems to be the given view. Now, those sorts of narratives emerge for all sorts of reasons. In conflict situations, they help keep cohesion with a group, they help mobilize a group, and they also justify the position that they're in. But of course, the reverse is also happening. It delegitimizes other positions. It casts another as a block, as an abstract stereotype. So I think that the lessons from conflict situations, you can see now, might help us to think about the construction of worldviews that operate inevitably in tourism, is that master narratives are not innocent. They underpin group thinking, but they also suppress and denigrate potentially other ways of seeing the world. So the question I want to really leave you with at the second section is, what insights might we gain from dark tourism for how we think about the encadrement of more, if you like, straightforward acts within the tourist industry? Is there a dark dimension inevitably to every visitor site? Is it always appropriate to identify that? How might we identify it and when? And if that seems a little problematic, just think in the environmental sphere. Most environmental tourism now flags the shrinkage of glaciers, the charred tree stumps from forest fires. It's pointing to the dark elements that are, if you like, bound up with that site through global action. So I'm suggesting that we might extend that to our thinking more broadly. So the good news is now we've rattled through history. We've rattled through a second history of peace and its relationship with tourism, with a rather deep dive into darkness and peace tourism and the importance of storytelling. My concluding section, as I said at the beginning, is very speculative and anecdotal, but that might suggest, through your own experiences, ways of thinking about, if you like, local sites that seem to have nothing to do with what I'm talking about. So this was a tourist visit that I made a couple of months ago to Devon, and it was a National Trust property. The National Trust, I think, is said to be the largest membership tourist organization in Europe. It's a hugely important tourist organization in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Scotland has its own version of the National Trust. And its function, its a mission statement is to preserve and protect buildings, coastline, and countryside. And very often, all of these things have been given as gifts. So the question is, what does that preservation mean? And what does it mean for today and for the visitors who engage with that preserved past? Now, before we go any further, it's important to locate, I think, this site. I don't know, who has been to Devon? Has anybody been to Devon? It is often referred to by the slightly jocular but pejorative phrase, deepest, darkest Devon, to imply that it is very far from the metropolis. It's not London. It's somewhere lost in the rural parts of England, forgotten. You can see that to get to Compton Castle, you have to drive down what are, for a person from the city, terrifyingly narrow and dark lanes. Over time, the lanes have got deeper and deeper, and the vegetation which conceals stone walls has got darker and darker. So it is really like driving through a labyrinth. What amused us, but not really with producing much laughter, was that there was no speed limit. You could drive as fast as you like down these lanes. We didn't manage to get above 20 miles an hour. They are windy, deep, dark lanes. So it felt that we were arriving in the middle of absolutely nowhere. Now, the absolutely nowhere you can see in the square on the map on the right. And the reasons for the colors on that map are to demarcate areas of social deprivation. The darker the color, the more indices of social deprivation. So these are areas that suffer from low income, but also, in this part of the world, very limited social mobility. People don't seem to move up or out, but people are, if you like, stuck to a much greater extent than other parts of the same county, but other parts of the country as a whole. So I think it's worth bearing in mind that this site that I was visiting is very close. It's about 6 kilometers from Torquay and Torbay, which are some of the most deprived areas currently in the UK. And tourism is hugely important in this region. International tourism contributes about 2.5 billion. 7.3 billion comes from the sector as a whole. 10% of employment in Devon comes from tourism. In Cornwall, which is the further down, it's 20%. But the tourism doesn't seem to be generating, if you like, the opportunities. Now, when we arrived, as I say, having gone down this deep, dark lane, we were greeted by an overly enthusiastic young volunteer and an older gentleman, both of whom declared that it had been a very poor season. There were very few cars parked there. And we were then ushered into the castle as such by another volunteer who was now a rather elderly lady who was dressed up in Tudor fancy dress. And she posed as a family member from the past, telling us about the story. And this was my initial moment of disquiet, is taking me to a sort of past that was really unconnected with the present. But the story that she told, with a good degree of pride, was that the house belongs still to the Gilbert family, and the claim to fame was that Sir Humphrey Gilbert, who was the half-brother of the more famous Sir Walter Raleigh. I don't know if Sir Walter Raleigh means much to anyone here, but he is somebody that all English school children have to study. He apparently threw his cape over a puddle to let Queen Elizabeth walk on dry land. But Sir Humphrey Gilbert, which was a name I'd never heard, is said to be the founder of the British Empire. Before sailing out to the New World, which took him many attempts, he had also been tried out by Queen Elizabeth with the colonization of Ireland. So within 10 minutes of entry into this castle, we'd been greeted with some pride about its connection with the colonization of Ireland, the colonization of the New World, and then the story continued with one of the descendants. You can see there the plaque in the New World of Sir Humphrey Gilbert. But the descendant on the 19th century, named after the more famous half-brother, Sir Walter Raleigh Gilbert, he had been an army officer in the British East India Company and commanded a division in the Second Anglo-Sikh War in the Punjab in the middle of the 19th century. Now, the Sikh army were extremely well trained and a real match for the East India Company. But in the last battle, the East India Company prevailed. And as you can see in the Punjab Medal, which commemorates Sir Walter Raleigh Gilbert, the Sikhs presented in a position of inferiority or of at least submission their weapons to this commander of the East India Company. Now, so far, within really a quarter of an hour, I had been given a story of the connections between this castle and some of the darkest moments of British history: the colonization of Ireland, the colonization of the New World, and the annexation of the Punjab, none of which had been said with any a question of there might be a different historical story. So for me, this was a moment of rather considerable cognitive dissonance and cultural gaps. I don't know about your own experience in your own life, but in Britain at the moment, what are called the culture wars are raging, but quite clearly they've not been raging equally across the entire country. And certainly the metropolitan spaces are far more tied up with debates on one side or the other. But what interested me was that, I think if I move on to the next slide, the National Trust has, in the national press, been at the center of these culture wars that have polarized public opinion in the national press, polarized political opinion, polarized debates as to whether tourism should be to enjoy gardens or whether it should be to right the wrongs of the past, but in ways that have created yet more conflict. Now, what I was interested in is how Compton Castle seemed to not have caught up with these discussions. But very mindful of my position coming from a relatively privileged metropolitan centre, it was not my role as a tourist to regale the volunteers with my apparently superior knowledge. So it left me thinking about where does a tourist site position itself in relation to the multiple conflicts and inequalities within the sector and on an international scale and within a country. All of these seem to come to, if you like, a focal point for me in Compton Castle. Subsequently, I looked up a few points. So if I go back to the previous slide, something that hadn't been told was that in the annexing of the Punjab, the treasury of the Sikhs passed to the British Crown. And it was at that moment, through that route, that the Kohinoor diamond came into the British Crown jewels. Now that we've all heard of, because that has been raging in the press around the coronation as to why we have it, whether we should give it back, we being the British government, the royal family, the we is always difficult. But anyway, King Charles decided that best not to wear the diamond as Prime Minister Modi would like it back. But this had been a topic of great international, or at least Anglo-Indian debate that wasn't part of the story. But something else that also wasn't mentioned is that Punjab medal commemorating Sir Walter Raleigh Gilbert was linked with this curiously solitary obelisk in Bodmin that is also on the map of the Black Lives Matter activism that should be toppled. So I got interested to see that this perhaps had extended to Devon, but at the same time what I found was actually a defense of the obelisk by the Sikhs, who one might have imagined would be against the obelisk. But the Sikh Museum, which is an online museum, has been campaigning to keep the traces of Anglo-Indian Sikh history alive. So they're for the obelisk. So at this point, my thinking was that actually there are so many stories that complicate the binaries that are raging in the metropolis that actually might make this rather insignificant castle, because there's not much actually to visit, more interesting and more attractive. As I explored the area for a day or two further, I walked along the River Dart. And I don't know what that suggests to you by way of image, but to me it looks really very rural. Along the Dart are some small, very weather-damaged tourist signposts with very concise bits of information, but very quickly one learns that in the past, the Dart had been a major artery for foreign arrivals and English departures. Pilgrims came in great number and landed in one of the local villages to come and see the relics of the murdered Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas à Becket. It was from here, I hadn't realized, that ships also sailed out, and not just from Plymouth, to defend the country against the Spanish Armada. It was from here that boats sailed out for not just the conquest of Newfoundland, which was the bit of land that Sir Humphrey Gilbert had apparently claimed for the crown at the heart of the British Empire, so we were told. But this had been a major artery connecting Devon with the rest of the world. So what I began to think at this point is that this place that seemed in the middle of absolutely nowhere, a castle that seemed absolutely extraordinarily lost in the middle of nowhere, with a statue even more in the middle of nowhere, had once upon a time been absolutely central. That it actually had so much history of international exchanges. Those are exchanges that, if they were told today, add to the complexity. They don't come down one side or the other, but create a vision of the complexity of exchanges that might put this rather lost area of the UK back into global exchanges and attract tourists and establish collaborations that might boost not only the tourist industry, but also provide an outward-looking perspective. Now, those are just speculative conclusions. I wouldn't dare to assert them as scholarly research, but in response to the thinking that I've been doing over decades on the intercultural, it seems to me that there are some conclusions that we might begin to take away, to think about. So here I've just, in order to try and round things up, put these in bullet points. But one thing I've been trying to stress is that the past has never been static. And therefore, if we look for, we will find traces, multiple traces, that connect a place that seems very local with a wider set of intercultural exchanges. I would suggest that we do well to look for those. A second point I've been stressing is hospitality is the welcome of the stranger. And the stranger is the person who's not like us, but to welcome somebody is not just to let them in a physical sense, but to open up psychologically, socially, culturally to the differences that are brought by those who are other than ourselves. And the third point that I'd like to stress is that the exchange of stories has always been central to hospitality. It was really codified in the classical world. Those of you who have read or heard of Odysseus will know that in the classical world, you wrote stories about people who arrived on strange places and told stories to other people as the condition of being a guest. But one of the things that has been pointed out is that it's all very well if you're traveling like Odysseus or traveling slowly. There's plenty of time for the intercultural. Modern mass tourism is seen as something that slides in quickly, that doesn't create a meaningful interface. And I've pointed out the dangers, and one of the dangers is that that can emphasize the distinction between us and them rather than bridge. It makes an outsider and an insider. It reinforces cultural stereotypes. So if it is important to nuance, to begin to unravel polarizing master narratives, but if there isn't much time, then what do we do? So one suggestion is that some of the storytelling we do in a site is not by interacting with locals or with, if you like, visitors. That might happen. But there is inevitably an interaction that is created by the framing of a site. That framing happens through all sorts of ways, through guides, through guidebooks, through little signs, through surrounding pointers. But at Compton Castle, there weren't any pointers to this wider world and its complexity. And my suggestion is that as there is so little time, providing clear and visible hooks to these exchanges, by focusing, say, on a Chinese vase, by focusing on a gift from somebody from the outside, could be sufficient to open up a master narrative, to create some spaces. When there isn't much time, when it's a short visit, nonetheless, to promote the presence of the foreign, the ostensibly foreign, might serve to make our narratives more hospitable. And as I said before, small gestures can add up. So I don't think I'll go through that slide, but leave you with questions that you might now wish to debate. Hospitality, you might think, is structured by host-guest relations. And tourism is often thought of in those terms, that there are the hosts who provide the hospitality and there are the guests who receive that hospitality. But is this the right way to think about things? So I started with Voltaire. I will finish with Voltaire and his Candide. The final lines of Candide is « Cela est bien dit, mais il faut cultiver notre jardin ». There are plenty of commercial products that have that line, « Il faut cultiver notre jardin ». The question I would like to ask you is a garden ever only itself? Almost every garden has plants that have originated from elsewhere. Are gardens necessarily bounded? Is Voltaire here, in talking about the activity of cultivating a garden, if it is metaphorical, is he talking about let's look after our patrimoine and let other people look after theirs? Now, certainly, if you get on the hop-on, hop-off bus in Cambridge, you are greeted with a rather divisive guest host slogan. It's the best way to see our beautiful city, and it seems to me rather unambiguous that the our is not that of the visitor. The visitor is not part of the first person plural. What do we mean then by those sites like the Canal du Midi that are now dubbed World Heritage Sites? Whose heritage is it? Who has the responsibility for looking after it? For whom is it? Do World Heritage Sites, in a straightforward way, create insiders and outsiders? So I point to you in the last image, because I enjoy being in your wonderful mountainous region. Do we think of mountains as belonging to people? Or when we enter into the world of nature, irrespective of property rights, do we not think rather more of the mountains, the environment, the tourist site itself as being the host? If we shifted from thinking of us, if we think of ourselves as local, as the host, to the site itself as being the host, that which has been and can continue to be hospitable to all who come, that can be open to and collect and get and conserve traces from the outside, might that create a different model for thinking about tourism and peace? So my final comment, I showed you the grand tourist and his selfie. It seems to me that one of the most important things about tourism is trying to connect one's own story with another place. That is why I'm suggesting that in the 18th century storytelling was so important, is how do we connect to each other and to a place. It seems to me that there is an urge to try and be in a place and to connect with it, even if one is de passage. And therefore, if we think of the notion of the mountain and those paths, they are paths that have connected people from all sorts of places over generation. And in that process, they serve to connect stories. So if there's one thing I want to suggest, that maybe the lessons from peace tourism, from peace studies, from dark tourism, is that reconciliation and adjusting injustices by challenging dominant master narratives that exclude others is really all about how we connect stories. So thank you for listening. I realize that my story has been long. I realize it might have been rather impenetrable, but I hope it has been a challenge for you to think along the way, how do you connect with it? Do you just let it move as if on a parallel road and you carry on yours? Or can one, how does one find ways of interconnecting stories? And it seems to me that that's at the heart of good tourism. And that's at the heart of tourism and peace, indeed of global peace and local justice more generally.